Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know we love to go deep on big topics, and today is no exception because we're diving into the future of nuclear energy.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
A while back, you mentioned wanting to wrap your head around clean energy options
Yeah.
and, frankly, just become more efficient at getting through complex topics, right?
Yeah.
So to tackle that, we decided to jump into a recent special report. Actually, it's called a special report. It's from the International Energy Agency, the IEA.
Yeah.
Right, so the report is called The Path to a New Era for Nuclear Energy.
This report's kind of like a really in-depth roadmap, and it shows where nuclear power stands globally today and all the challenges it's facing, and even goes all the way out to 2050. Where is this all headed?
So essentially, you're saying it's like a comprehensive assessment.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay, so what all does it cover? How did the IEA go about this whole thing?
Well, they really looked at everything. I mean, they considered different energy policies that governments could implement,
Oh,
and how those policies could either speed up or slow down the growth of nuclear power.
okay.
And they looked at the role of innovation and, of course, new reactor technologies. You know how important government support's going to be. And, of course, the funding and who's going to pay for all of this.
Right.
Now, it is important for you to know that while many of the IEA's member countries and the countries that are associated with the IEA, they all see nuclear energy playing a big role in the future.
Yeah.
Not every country feels that way, and the IEA definitely respects that. They acknowledge that there are diverse perspectives, and they've tried to take that into account.
Absolutely. So even with some countries kind of going in different directions, what's the overall picture the IEA paints for nuclear energy? What's the momentum?
Well, it's interesting because even though we are seeing some nations phase out nuclear power, the report actually says that global nuclear electricity generation is likely going to hit an all-time high in 2025.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it kind of signals a potential comeback for nuclear. A lot of people don't see that coming.
A resurgence. That's interesting because that's not the headline you always see, right?
Yeah, it's not the common narrative. But the report highlights that interest in nuclear energy is at its highest point since, well, think back to the 1970s, the oil crises.
Oh, wow.
There are over 40 countries now, over 40 countries that are actually supporting an expansion of nuclear power in their energy mix.
Over 40 countries. That's pretty significant.
It is. And it's all happening at a time when the world's demand for electricity is projected to just skyrocket. I mean, the report forecasts that global electricity demand is going to grow 6 times faster in the next decade than it has in the past decade.
Wow, 6 times. What's driving that?
Well, think about all the electric vehicles hitting the roads. Think about those massive data centers springing up everywhere. They're energy hogs. It all requires way more power than we're using today.
Yeah.
So the IEA, they think that nuclear, working in tandem with renewable sources, things like solar, wind, they think that combination could be really crucial in meeting this enormous demand, this growing demand, in a way that's both reliable and, importantly, sustainable.
Yeah, for sure. Sustainable and secure, right?
Yeah.
All right, so that paints a pretty clear picture of where things stand. Let's dig into the specifics. Like, what's the current status of nuclear energy globally, and what are some of the key trends that the IEA wants us to know about?
So the IEA says that nuclear energy already makes a big contribution to low emissions electricity. Right now, globally, it produces more clean electricity than any other source out there except for hydropower.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you look at advanced economies, the IEA says it's actually the single largest source of low emissions electricity. And to put a number on that, it accounts for about 17% of their total electricity supply as of 2023.
Okay, to be honest, that's actually a bigger slice of the clean energy pie than I'd realized.
Yeah.
Which countries are really leading the pack in nuclear energy right now?
So the ones that stand out, the ones with the highest percentage of nuclear in their overall electricity mix are France and the Slovak Republic. I mean, France gets something like 65% of its electricity from nuclear power.
Really? 65%?
Yeah, and the Slovak Republic is over 60%.
Wow.
Now the U.S., it has the most reactors in the world. It has 94 of them that are operational.
What?
But, its nuclear share is actually lower. It only accounts for less than a fifth of their total electricity supply.
So having a lot of reactors doesn't necessarily equal the highest reliance on it, I guess.
No, not necessarily. You've got to look at the percentage, too.
That's interesting. Okay, so tell me about the geographic trends then.
Yeah.
Where is nuclear growing the most, and where might it be declining?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. So back in the 90s, Europe was dominant. They were the leaders in nuclear power, but their industry has actually shrunk since then. And now, if you look at all the plants being built around the world, like those under construction right now, about half of them are in China.
Half? That's a huge concentration in one country.
It is a big concentration, and the projection is that China will overtake both the European Union and the United States in terms of nuclear capacity by 2030.
Wow.
And here's another interesting tidbit. Of the 52 reactors that started construction since 2017, a whopping 25 of them are using Chinese designs and 23 are using Russian designs.
That's got to raise some eyebrows, right?
It does. I mean, that kind of concentration in terms of who's building and whose technology is being used.
Yeah.
The IEA sees that as a potential risk.
I would think so, yeah. So it kind of underscores the need to have more options, right? Secure supply chains for nuclear technology going forward.
It really does, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so China's building a lot, but what's happening with the existing nuclear plants around the world, especially in those advanced economies we were just talking about?
Well, one thing that the IEA points out is that there's a challenge, a big challenge, with aging infrastructure. The average age of a reactor in these advanced economies is over 36 years old now, and many of them are kind of reaching the end of their original licenses, which tend to be around 40 years.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so now countries are facing this choice. Do they shut those plants down, or do they invest tons of money into extending their lifespans?
That's a tough choice. Can you give me some specific examples, like where are we seeing these aging fleets?
Sure. In the US, the average age of the fleet is 41 years old. In France, it's 37, and Japan's is around 32. So a big chunk of this low-carbon energy, these important sources, are kind of getting up there in age.
Yeah, that's a big concern for maintaining that low emissions electricity supply for sure. So what about building new large-scale plants in these advanced economies? Is that happening?
It is, but it's not without its challenges. New projects in the US and France, they've seen some pretty big delays and some really big cost overruns.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the Vauxhall Units 3 and 4 in the US and the Flamanville 3 project in France are perfect examples.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about those.
Yeah.
So what's causing these delays? Why are these projects so over budget?
It's a few things. You know, these projects are complex, they're massive, that's part of it. But another factor is that many of these countries, they haven't built a new reactor in a while. It's been 10, 20 years in some cases.
Oh, wow.
And that means they've had to rebuild a lot of the industrial capacity and the skilled workforce needed to pull these projects off. They had to start almost from scratch in some cases.
Right. So it's like if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah, exactly.
So are there any exceptions to this? Any success stories, like projects that have gone more smoothly?
There are. South Korea and the UAE have managed to have more moderate delays and cost increases in their recent projects.
Okay, that's good to hear. Like which projects specifically?
Like Korea's Seoul reactors and the Baraka plant in the UAE. Those are some bright spots.
Okay, so we've got aging plants and new large-scale plants are pretty tough to get off the ground, at least in some places. But didn't you say that investment in nuclear was actually increasing overall?
That's right. Even with these issues, investment in nuclear is going up. The annual investment, both in new plants and in extending the life of existing ones, it's jumped by almost 50% since 2020. It actually topped $60 billion in 2023. So that tells you something. Despite the problems, there's a lot of faith in nuclear's long-term role.
Yeah, there's definitely still belief in it. So let's talk about why. What's driving this renewed interest? You mentioned energy security earlier.
Yeah, energy security is a big one. The world's gotten a lot less stable in recent years, right?
That's for sure.
And that's making countries really think about where their energy comes from. They're looking at nuclear as a reliable, homegrown source of energy that's less vulnerable to the price swings and, frankly, the disruptions that come with fossil fuels.
Right, it makes total sense, especially now. So are there other policy factors that are pushing this trend?
Yeah, definitely. The IEA is saying that we're seeing stronger policy support for nuclear around the world. There are over 40 countries now that are either planning new reactors or seriously considering them.
Wow, okay.
And there's a global push, too. In December of 23, over 20 countries pledged to triple global nuclear capacity by 2050. Even more countries joined that commitment at COP29 this year.
So that's a big political signal, right? It gives the industry some momentum.
Absolutely. And it's not just about building new reactors. There's also this push to keep the existing fleet running longer.
Right, like lifetime extensions, right?
Exactly. So extending the life of existing plants, that's happening all over the place.
Hmm.
Armenia, Belgium, Czech Republic, Spain, even the US. Japan's gone as far as to change their laws to allow reactors to run past 60 years under certain conditions. And they've even got a program now to encourage these lifetime extensions.
Wow, they're serious about it. So government's playing a role in new construction and in squeezing more life out of existing plants. What about technology? We've heard so much about small modular reactors, SMRs. How do they fit into all of this?
Well, SMRs are generating a lot of excitement, and there's a good reason. The IEA thinks they could be a real game changer for the industry
Okay.
because they're smaller and they're modular, meaning they can be built in factories and shipped to the site. That means they're potentially cheaper upfront, they take less time to build, and they might even be less risky financially than the giant traditional nuclear plants.
So that would make nuclear more accessible and quicker to roll out, right?
Exactly.
Are these things just a concept, though? No. Or are SMRs actually being built?
Well, there's a lot of momentum.
Hmm.
The IEA says that there are over 80 different SMR designs being developed right now all over the world. A lot of that work's happening in those advanced economies. And importantly, the first commercial SMRs are expected to start operating around 2030.
So that's coming up soon. Wow. So beyond just making electricity, are there any other potential uses for nuclear power, especially these SMRs?
Yeah, the report talks about some interesting stuff. Data centers, for example, they need a ton of power and they're under pressure to go green.
Yeah.
Their need for reliable, always-on power lines up perfectly with nuclear, especially the more flexible SMRs. There's already talk about maybe 25 gigawatts of SMR capacity just for data centers, mostly in the US.
25 gigawatts just for data centers. That's a whole new market.
It is, and that's not all. The report also mentions other potential applications. For example, some countries are already using nuclear power for seawater desalination.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
And in the future, some advanced reactor designs could provide heat for industrial processes, even things like producing hydrogen, which is a big deal for clean energy.
So the potential uses for nuclear go way beyond just powering our homes and businesses. Now, the IEA lays out different scenarios for how nuclear investment might play out over the next few decades. What's the big takeaway from those scenarios?
Well, the overarching theme, no matter which scenario you look at, is that global investment in nuclear is projected to increase. That's true in their stated policy scenario, or STEP S, which is based on what governments are actually doing right now. It's true in the announced pledges scenario, or APS, which takes into account all the climate and energy pledges that countries have made. And it's also true in their most ambitious scenario, the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, or NZE.
So no matter what, the IEA thinks we'll be seeing more money going into nuclear. Can you give me some hard numbers from these scenarios? Like how much are we talking about?
Yeah, sure. In the APS, the one that assumes countries meet their climate pledges, the report estimates that annual investment in nuclear could reach $120 billion by 2030.
Wow.
That's a lot of money. And under that scenario, global nuclear capacity would more than double by mid-century. The total cumulative investment from 2024 to 2050 in that scenario, it's estimated to be a mind-blowing $2.5 trillion.
$2.5 trillion. That's a staggering amount. Where do SMRs fit into all this?
Well, SMRs are expected to become a bigger and bigger part of the picture. In that APS scenario, the cumulative investment in SMRs is projected to hit $670 billion by 2050. And when you look at the overall nuclear capacity, it's projected to grow a lot. It'll reach 650 gigawatts in the STEPS scenario, 870 in the APS, and over 1,000 gigawatts in that NZE scenario by 2050. And in that APS specifically, we could see over 1,000 individual SMRs deployed by the middle of the century, representing about 120 gigawatts of capacity.
And the IEA even suggests that SMR deployment could be even greater if construction costs come down, right?
They do. If SMRs become cheaper to build, they estimate that the total deployed capacity could reach 190 gigawatts by 2050 in that APS scenario.
So that's a pretty significant potential upside for SMRs. What about geography? Will China continue to dominate? Or could we see a shift in who's leading the way?
Well, the IEA thinks there's a good chance that advanced economies could make a comeback in nuclear technology, both through new large-scale reactors and through SMR development. In the APS, European and U.S. technologies could make up around 45% of all the new large-scale reactor construction in the 2030s, which is a huge jump from the less than 5% they've seen recently. And when it comes to SMRs, the report projects that advanced economies will dominate that market, accounting for over 60% of all SMR installations by 2040, with the U.S. leading the charge. However, when you look at total installed capacity for SMRs, China is still projected to be the top market in that APS scenario.
So it's going to be a more diverse landscape in terms of where the technology comes from. What about the cost? Can nuclear actually compete with other energy sources in the future?
Well, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
The IEA says that the future of nuclear really hinges on the industry's ability to build projects on time and on budget. The upfront costs are high, and financing these projects isn't cheap. But their projections show that the levelized cost of electricity for nuclear in 2040, in that APS scenario, is actually competitive with other low-emission options that can be dispatched when needed, like hydropower and bioenergy. So the potential is there for nuclear to be economically viable.
Okay, so cost is still an issue, but the projections look promising. Now let's talk about the things that need to be in place to make this growth in nuclear possible. The report talks a lot about supply chains and workforce. What are the key points there?
Well, diversifying both the technology leadership, like we were just talking about, and the supply chains for things like uranium fuel and enrichment services, that's absolutely essential for a secure and affordable expansion of nuclear power.
So why is it so important to diversify those supply chains?
Because right now there's a lot of concentration in certain parts of the supply chain, and that makes the whole industry vulnerable. The report says that the production of uranium, for instance, is concentrated in just 4 countries. Kazakhstan alone accounts for 43% of global production.
Wow.
And the capacity to enrich uranium, which you need to do to make it usable in most reactors, that's also really concentrated. Russia has a 40% share of the global market. So that kind of concentration, it can lead to disruptions and price spikes, which are bad for everyone.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. So what are countries doing to deal with that?
Well, several countries are working on diversifying their nuclear fuel supply. The US, France, the UK, and the Netherlands are all planning new uranium enrichment facilities. Japan's even restarted their enrichment activities. These are all steps in the right direction, creating more resilience in the supply chain.
Good. So what about the workforce? What kind of people do we need to actually build and run all these new nuclear plants?
That's another important issue. The IEA says we need to be thinking about workforce planning now to avoid problems down the road. We need enough skilled workers to build, operate, maintain, and eventually decommission all these nuclear facilities. It's a big task.
It is. Are there any other potential bottlenecks that the report mentions?
Yes. They point out that the capacity for making large ingots, which are essential for building reactor parts, is limited and concentrated in just a few countries. That could become a problem if there's a big surge in nuclear construction.
So we need to be thinking about fuel, workforce, and even the capacity to make certain components. Now, let's talk about money. How are all these nuclear projects going to be financed? The report says that's a unique challenge.
It is. Financing nuclear power projects is a bit different from other energy infrastructure projects. The sheer size, the massive upfront costs, the long construction times, and the perceived risks, those all make it tougher to get funding. Traditional lenders are often hesitant to back nuclear projects because they can take decades to pay off and there's always some uncertainty involved.
Makes sense. So historically, who's been footing the bill for these big nuclear projects?
Governments and state-owned utilities have been the main sources of funding. And the report makes it clear that government involvement is often crucial to get commercial banks on board. They need some kind of risk mitigation or guarantees to feel comfortable lending money for nuclear.
So private investors haven't been too keen on nuclear so far.
Not really, no. The long timelines and the risks make it a tough sell. But that might be changing with the arrival of SMRs.
So those SMRs are shaking things up again.
They could be. Because they're smaller and potentially faster to build, the overall investment is lower, and the payback period could be shorter, maybe even half the time of a traditional reactor. That might make them more appealing to private investors.
Okay, so that's promising. What other things could help to de-risk these investments and bring in more funding from different sources?
Well, having predictable cash flow is important. That can be achieved through things like long-term power purchase agreements, contracts for difference, and regulated asset-based models. These mechanisms basically give investors more certainty about their returns.
Makes sense.
And then there's the whole green and transition finance movement. There's a growing trend to include nuclear energy in those financing schemes, especially in the EU. That could open up a lot of new funding avenues.
Yeah, definitely. What about the big international development banks? Can they play a role in financing nuclear?
The report says they can, but they have limited resources. Those multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, they can help catalyze projects, but they don't have the financial firepower to fund large-scale nuclear on their own.
Right, they have other priorities too. Okay, before we wrap up, we need to talk about safety, decommissioning, and waste. What does the IEA have to say about these crucial issues?
They're very clear that safety is absolutely paramount. The report stresses the need for multiple redundant safety systems at every nuclear facility. It also highlights the importance of strong regulations and industry self-policing to ensure that safety standards are met.
And with so many reactors getting old, decommissioning is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, right?
It is. There are already 210 reactors that have been permanently shut down globally, so dealing with those plants and the waste they produce is a major focus. The costs of decommissioning are usually included in the lifetime cost of a plant, and most countries have laws that require funding to be set aside for decommissioning.
And what about the long-term storage of radioactive waste?
That's the really long game, right?
Yeah,
The report mentions progress in developing permanent waste disposal solutions, like deep underground repositories. Switzerland's working on one of those.
so there are solutions being developed.
Yeah.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've taken a deep dive into the IEA's take on the future of nuclear. So for you, our listener, here's the big picture.
Nuclear power is showing signs of a resurgence.
Yeah.
It's being driven by concerns about energy security, the push to achieve climate goals, and new technologies like SMRs. But as we've seen, there are still challenges.
Absolutely. We've talked about the issues with costs, the need to diversify supply chains, and the complexities of financing these projects. But for you, as someone who wants to understand clean energy and make sense of complex topics, this deep dive should highlight that nuclear has a big role to play in our electrified future. It's clean and it's reliable.
And the development of SMRs could be a real game changer.
Totally. So to leave you with something to think about.
What do you think will be the single most important factor in determining whether this new era for nuclear energy actually becomes a reality? Will it be government policy, technological progress, creative financing, or something else entirely?
The IEA report offers a lot of data and analysis, and hopefully our deep dive has made it a little easier to graph.
Yeah, we've given you a head start.
But definitely check out the full report if you want to go even deeper. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.